So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's David Pope. I'm not the ex-fraudster.
Nope, that's me.
Yeah. So, this session is part of some work we've been doing recently at Experian to get inside the mind of the fraudster. We've been going inside prisons to interview convicted fraudsters to understand the who, the when, the what, the where, the how, and the why of identity fraud. Some of those fraudsters inside prison actually introduced us to fraudsters on the outside as well. And so we're trying to build a picture of the modus operandi of the fraudster with which we can share that content, that thought leadership with all our peers in the fraud prevention industry. So Elliot, let's start right at the beginning. How did you get started? What was the first act of fraud that you committed?
Well, the first major thing, was when I was working, as you said, in a call centre for a major British mobile phone network, and I was just made aware of, constant details, credit card details coming through, and this would have been back in sort of about 1999, around about then. So, the controls weren't quite as tight. For one, we were allowed to keep notepads at our desks, which I think a lot of call centres have just said, that's absolutely not allowed. But yeah, I had all these details coming through for various different customers, and I was acutely aware of how they could possibly be used. So I started keeping a notebook of information, just people's names and addresses and credit card numbers, etc. And obviously, one other thing I was aware of at the time was that people wouldn't be able to use this information to do much unless they had further information. So it progressed on to putting people on hold and explaining that there'd been an issue with their card, and I had to call the issuer. So at that point, I would put them on hold and come back a moment later and say, yep, your bank's on the phone and they need to know your mother's maiden name, your date of birth, your work phone number, and just however much information I felt I could reasonably get out of them without arousing suspicion.
And so when you did it for the first time, was it an opportunistic thing that you did? Did you go into work that day thinking I'm going to do this, or was it a spur of the moment decision to try and fish that customer for some of their identity details?
This was I worked for that company for about a month, and it was just something that sort of came to me one day. It wasn't something that I started working for that person, for that company to do specifically. But obviously, yeah, very much opportunistic.
Okay, so it was opportunistic. It was there and then. Did you actually, on the train in to work that day, did you think I'm going to do this, or did you suddenly just do it on the spur of the moment?
Well, obviously, I knew credit cards were handy for buying things, but it wasn't really something that I'd kind of expected to do until I got into work and I was made aware of the potential of these credit card details that were coming through.
So you'd have the customer there, you'd put them on hold, and then come back pretending to be the bank and ask them further questions.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, sure. And when you were harvesting these credit card details, how did you store it all? Did you have were you like a sort of a cyber fraudster there with a massive hard drive full of these details, or did you write them down in a notebook? Or
no, well, as I said earlier, we had them written. Well, I had them written down in a notebook initially. But what happened later? I left that call centre. I was sacked for being late, of all things. It's quite unbelievable, really. But I left the call centre and ran away down south to try and, I don't know what I was trying to do. I was about 17, 18, thought I knew everything, but I knew absolutely nothing. So ran away down south to Manchester and then ran out of details after I started using these details, calling the banks, getting cards sent out, ordering things. Eventually the details ran out and I had to find a new method of getting this information, which, at the time, I was living on it, As was said earlier, I started off, it was kind of CDs, haircuts, really kind of arbitrary things that didn't cost very much. But once I realised that there was such a thing as first class and expensive hotels, the game changed slightly at that point.
And just in terms of background and context, I think you then had, a 4-year spree of going around the world? Using other
I think it was almost 5 years, of absolute chaos and madness. All very enjoyable madness, I won't lie. It got to the point where I didn't have any details left in this book. So what was next was to find another way. And I would what I did was I checked into a hotel one day, and I realised that people check into hotels and they always leave a credit card at reception, or details of the credit card. So I put two and two together and then decided that what I was going to do was call hotels and ask to speak to people and try and get information from them over the phone. But obviously I couldn't spend all day hanging around hotel receptions, pretending to read the newspaper. So what I devised was a method whereby I would call the hotel in question and ask for someone with a very popular surname, so Smith or Jones or something like that. And more often than not, there would be someone in the hotel with that name. So I would be put through to the room, and then I would just say to the person, that I was the duty manager, and I'm so sorry, but we've had a problem processing the credit card that you left with us. So could I please go through some information with you? And the process would then repeat. And I think it's important to point out, actually, this was very successful. I'd say it had at least 80% success rate of getting some information. But a lot of the time, it was a case of just kind of working out from the person's voice and, hesitation, etc., whether or not it was worth pursuing it any further, or was one more question going to make it suspicious? Because you could always go away and work out the other information yourself sometimes, addresses, work details, the internet was very handy for that, postcodes, etc.
So that's quite interesting. So essentially what you were doing, your way of harvesting identities, credit cards, was essentially through a contract, whereas other fraudsters, of course, go on to to online carding supermarkets to buy other details. What other means of identity theft did the fraudsters do? By your understanding, how did they get hold of compromised cards?
I mean, if you mean, well, there's so many. I mean, basically, anything it's possible for a person to know about themselves, it's possible for a fraudster to find out if that person believes that they should know. So, you've got, like I just said, you can call someone over the phone, convince them that you are someone who needs to know this information, or you could go rifling through bins and hope to come across someone's council tax bill, credit card bill, anything really that gives you some detail. And then it's just a case, I guess, a good analogy would be to say that it's like a jigsaw, because once you have one piece, it becomes much easier to find out the other pieces. And once you have the whole jigsaw, obviously, then, well, that person's in trouble. So there's so many methods that you could use to find. Social networking is another one as well. I think someone mentioned that earlier, where people are going on and gaining trust of people on social networks and just asking them kind of questions that would seem kind of normal things to ask, like what's your star sign or something like that, and then obviously garnering other information from that. Oh yeah, that's my star sign too. Blah blah blah.
Yeah,
so.
This is one of the issues that Kate at Marketforce wanted us to touch on today, and this is one of the ways that that fraudsters get hold of compromised cards. This comes no shock to any of you in the audience, but this is what they call a carding supermarket. And so here, this is a fraudster called Hacker CC who's selling his card details. So he's saying, selling CVV with cheap price, I'm always checked and I too ensure my CVV all good before sell you. So my first conclusion is that fraudsters are pretty crap at grammar. And then it says, and I hope we will deal long time, I hate ripper, scammer. So my second conclusion is that on these carding supermarkets, fraudsters are doing fraud against each other, which kind of fills my heart with joy. And so here we have Hacker CC, and here he is his price list. It's volume driven. The more you buy, the cheaper per unit it is. But there's another screen grab that I thought I'd bring up as well, and this goes beyond fraudsters selling information to each other, but this is about fraudsters sharing best practice. And so here we have a fraudster whose handle on the forum is called AmbigBoy, and he's saying, please, does anyone know a cardable site that ships from the US to the UK? So cardable, in their parlance, is a site that has very few defences in place. And so Shafiq, the site administrator, he then goes, here you go, here's a list of sites that our community has said are pretty good with which to target ID fraud. The other side of things as well is Elliot's modus operandi, which is more of a con trick. One of the fraudsters we spoke to, they used to practically target sites. Some websites say, please don't press the order button twice, or your card will be charged. Just wait for the page to complete. And one of these fraudsters we spoke to, they actually look for those kind of sites on purpose, press the order button twice, then they actually call into the customer service line saying, oh, please don't charge my card twice, I didn't mean to. At which point the customer service agent thinks, oh yeah, so poor legitimate customer, they don't want to have the card charged twice. That's when the customer service people let their guard down, and that's when the fraudster strikes, and that's when they change their delivery address, they buy 3 laptops instead of 1, et cetera, et cetera. But Elliot, so back to the banks. How did you get hold of the cards once you'd got the card number and the address, all that sort of thing?
Well, what I would do is I would call the bank and I would go through the security process with them, and then I would ask them to send out a replacement card, either in the person's name or in my name. I would add myself as an account, an additional card holder to the account. But what the general process went something like this. I got the card details, then I would call the bank, change the card member's address and have a new card sent out. Once the card arrived, I would call the bank again and say, okay, look, sorry, but we actually moved back to that address again, or something, change the address back to the same address again. And at that time, a lot of banks didn't keep sort of on the screen anyway records of, where the cards went to. So there was no kind of instantly available record of where the card had been sent to. And I mean, the thing as well is that I remember hearing from various different police officers who told me that the problems that they had getting details and information off the bank was just, it wasn't worth their time, because it was the paperwork was immense for something which essentially to them isn't a particularly good charge to get someone on, or whatever, if it's just something small. So so there were all these problems happening as well.
Okay. So what about the banks? Do you think they had adequate defences in place? Did you find that you like to target one bank, one issuer, better than another, or?
Well, I mean, definitely, yeah. I mean, there were some banks whose security questions were so predictable that the minute I knew someone's card number or the first 6 digits of it, I'd be able to say, okay, I know that's X bank, and I know they ask this, this, and this. So that was the questions that I would then ask the cardholder. I had particular favourite in American Express because they were just ridiculously easy. And they had corporate cards as well, which just didn't matter how much you used them, they just kept working every single time. It was fantastic. And I mean, there was one time, it was like 3 months, I think. What happened was the cardholder got the bill, but someone at the company paid the bill, even though I'd spent 25 grand on the card. They just kept paying it, and this happened like 3 months in a row. Unbelievable. I couldn't believe my luck.
How many cards did you have on the go at any one time?
Oh, well, I think the maximum probably would have been about maybe 10 or 12 at once. At one time, yeah, about 10 or 12, no more than that, because I couldn't remember all the information.
Yeah, how did you manage all that? I mean, did you write things?
Initially, yeah, I wrote things down. When I first got the information, I wrote it down. I mean, I think I must have filled up. Those little pads that you get in the hotel when they sit it next to your phone for writing messages down. I must have filled up hundreds of those. But obviously, it would have been quite foolish to keep them, so I usually put them in the bin straight away after I'd memorised the information. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Let's think about it from the victim's perspective. Did you perceive them as victims? Did you think about what you were doing to people?
At the time, no.
And I mean the victims as the consumers, not the companies you're defrauding.
At the time, not really, because I was under the impression. My mum lost her card when I was about 12, and I remember the drama that happened when the card bill arrived, and there was some purchase on it that she hadn't made, and she hit the roof, and my dad came in, and they were really upset, and they phoned up, and it turned out that it was absolutely fine because the bank told her that they were going to cover it. So I just always thought, well, it's fine, it doesn't make any difference because people aren't really losing anything. And I guess that was a sort of teenage error on my part, because having had it happen to me recently as well, I realise it's not a particularly nice thing to happen. So yeah, it has happened to me actually. So not quite in that sense, but I purchased something on a website, and the company charged my card a lot more than what they should have done, and apparently it was a scam. They were doing this to quite a lot of people, so I had a bit of trouble getting the money back from the bank. But eventually they did give it back to me. So.
Okay. What about law enforcement then? Yeah,
My favourite people in the whole world.
I mean, that sort. I'm sure there's varying opinions in the audience about how proactive law enforcement have been. I think the UK was a bit slow to respond to the to the fraud problem. It was only like 2006 when we got going. The DCPCU, National Fraud Authority, and then ultimately the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau. But I think you were able to get away with what you were doing because there was no there was no central pot of there's no central fraud strategy or there's no fraud investigators.
Absolutely,
Would that be true?
It's funny, that was mentioned a few times earlier, and it's so true. I mean, this information sharing thing, it's so undervalued. If people talked more, then they would be able to sort of catch people quicker. And I know that there's obviously legislation in place that says that you have to follow certain procedures, etc. But just as it applies to banking, I'm sure it applies to insurance as well. Yeah.
So would more data sharing have stopped you? Anne Green from Aviva earlier talked about how it's never the names and the addresses, but the IP addresses and the devices. So one of the things we've done recently is to integrate iovation into our fraud prevention tools. They've got something daft like 1.2 billion devices in the world that they know about, and that's not just phones, it's laptops, tablets, etc. And out of that, they've got I think 12 million known fraudulent devices. So if you knew that your device was being tracked when you were about to do fraud, would that have stopped you?
No.
Okay.
It wouldn't have stopped me because I didn't matter what anyone said or did to me at that point in my life. I was in a position where I wasn't going to stop until I was ready to stop. I thought I knew exactly what I was doing, and I thought I knew everything.
And is that a common trait, do you think, fraudsters doing fraud because they think that they're doing it with impunity? They don't think they're going to get caught?
I can't speak for every fraudster, but I think a lot of them they'll just keep doing it and doing it and doing it because it's so easy. I mean, if, having that kind of money in your life when you're so young as well, it's very addictive.
Right. So it's a temptation thing. So to come back to. I think it was Scott from Go Compare. He said, is the British public ready to be honest? How would you answer? When would you answer that question?
I think, call me an optimist, but I think most of the British public are honest. Some of them are probably too frightened to lie because they're worried about what might happen. I mean, I know people who just they won't even consider doing anything vaguely kind of. Like, I don't know, I don't want to say illegal because there's different, I think people perceive different levels of illegality, so you've got like, throwing litter on the street is actually illegal, but a lot of people do it anyway because they don't think it really affects anyone. And then, so you've got different levels and stuff. I think when it gets to a certain point, you've got to say, right, okay, that's completely unacceptable.
Yeah, I buy into that model. I think there's a degree of fraudster in all of us, just to
exactly. And some people will think, oh well, actually it's sort of like what I used to think. No one's really getting hurt here because, what banks have got billions of pounds, and I'm only taking a few thousand, so no one's really actually getting hurt. I'm not going to cry crocodile tears for the banks, but I think the experiences that people had as a result of things like what I did, certainly isn't right and shouldn't be done.
At the same time, though, you were living a lie. Did you find it personally quite difficult to lie to your friends and family or people you met about who you were and what you were doing?
Yeah, definitely. It was a very hard time because, I mean, people laugh when I say that because they're like, how can you say that? You were off spending millions of pounds around the world. Having a great time, and yeah, most of it was fun, but when you don't have anyone to share it with because you can't tell them who you are really, because it's like, what do you do for a living? I'm a fraudster. That's not an acceptable profession. So it's difficult to kind of I felt as though I had to lie to everyone about just about every aspect of my life, and it was difficult as well because when I did meet people who I genuinely liked and genuinely had rapport with, they still wouldn't know who I really was deep inside. Or or at least how I got my money. So that was all quite hard, yeah.
Okay. What might have stopped you? Are there any technologies you see that might have stopped you? I know you're no fan of 3D Secure. For example, the verification schemes from Visa and
3D Secure wouldn't have. I was still doing fraud when 3D Secure came into operation. Chip and pin started, but it wasn't absolutely obligatory at that time. It just I think there was a window period of about, I don't know, a year or something like that, between terminals arriving in shops and people being told that you have to use your pin now. Is that right?
Yep.
About a year, isn't it? So at that point, this was fantastic for me. Why? Because there was nothing for me to sign, no paper for me to touch, no fingerprints to be seen, no signatures to be analysed at a later point by the police and, say, oh yes, that's your handwriting or whatever. So this was great. I had all the details I needed, so I had the PIN number as well. So I just popped into the shop, bought whatever it was I was buying, put the number in, walked out. And for me, that was an absolute gift. I can't even tell you, because it took so much worry off my mind with regard to, was someone going to catch me out by any of those methods? The only thing that could have caught me would have been CCTV, which I knew most shops don't keep past a week, because it's usually just there for armed robberies.
Okay. So how did it all come to an end then? How did you get caught?
Well, I got caught because I got stupid and greedy. And a part of me, now looking back on this as more of an adult, in fact, no, just an adult. I wasn't really an adult then, I don't think. Part of me thinks that it was mainly because I had enough of the lifestyle, really, or just the constant lies and, But what happened was I took a trip over to Edinburgh. I lived in Belfast at this point in time. I'd rented a flat there, and I'd invited a friend of mine to come away on holiday with me. So we were due to go to Amsterdam, but I had this little thing that I would always do before I travelled anywhere, which is I would call the airline and pretend to be calling from the central reservations desk at the airport. From the reservations desk at the airport. And then I would say to them, look, our systems are down at the moment. Can you please check this flight for me and just check this guy's booking? And most of the time it was fine, but sometimes they would come back and say, sorry, but there's a bit of a problem with that one. There's a fraud warning on it. So that happened this particular day. We were supposed to be flying out. And it was just too late to get anywhere else that was kind of good. So we ended up going to Edinburgh. And we were checked into the hotel, had a good night's sleep, and then the following morning I woke up and decided I was going to go out and go some early morning shopping before my friend woke up. So ran straight up the road to Harvey Nichols, walked up to the customer service desk and bought £2,000 of gift vouchers on some credit card, I don't know which one. And the girl said to me, do you have any ID? Because obviously it's quite a lot of money. And I said, no, I don't, but it's fine, that's it, it was American Express, I knew it. Call American Express, it's fine, they'll verify everything. So she picked up the phone and rang the referrals hotline, or whatever you call it. And they spoke to me. Obviously I knew all the information I needed to know, so they verified the transaction. And I left the store, went back to the hotel, picked up my mate and said, right, okay, we're going shopping for clothes. And then this is where it got stupid, because I returned to the shop no more than half an hour later to start spending the vouchers. But what had happened at this point was, and I didn't know anything about this until a couple of years later at least, was that after I left the store, she just knew something wasn't right. And she picked up the phone and called back American Express and said, I've got a feeling that something's not right about this. And they in turn called the cardholder, who probably swore down the phone and said that he didn't just buy £2,000 of gift vouchers. And that was it, really. On my way around the menswear department, went to the loo, came back out the loo, and there was a big burly guy standing in front of me, ready to pounce on me, and that was pretty much the end.
Okay, so what's more important, analytics, referencing, or the sniff test? The people on the front line.
Absolutely.
Have to weed out fraud.
That's it. I mean, you can't. There's no alternative for that. I mean, I think that at this moment in time, you can have the best computer technology in the world, but at the end of the day, a person's gut feeling sometimes is all it takes to catch someone out. And especially with some of the work with some of my clients that I'm doing now is something that I'm beginning to realise even more. I mean, don't get me wrong, these technologies do have a place. There's no doubt about that. They definitely do have a place. I know this is not a sort of banking conference, but just to give you an example, one of the pieces of advice that I often give to my financial clients is that they should always try and train their frontline staff in even basic ways of catching people out. Maybe I put that the wrong way actually, not so much catching people out, but just being alert and aware of tricks that people might use to try and get them to give more information out or to do something they shouldn't do or whatever. I think that's a pretty important thing to think about.
So you're now working with a few financial services firms.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I can't believe how my life's turned around. I mean,
poacher turned gamekeeper.
Well, it's just crazy. I mean, I still now go to my bed some nights and just think about how mental it is that, but only 10 years ago I was in prison for what I did, and now I'm actually on the other side of the fence. I think, yeah, it's been a good experience, and it's always interesting and sometimes quite funny as well to hear about some of the lengths that fraudsters will go to try and get. I mean, it's just unbelievable sometimes.
So I think we might be roughly out of time. So I guess if we've got questions for
This always
Elliot,
happens.
then
5 minutes of questions. Is everyone okay with that? I know it's going to eat into your lovely lunch, but we're okay with 5 minutes? Yeah. Do you want any questions from the floor? Microphone? Yeah.
Hi, Elliot. Firstly, I think you're really brave doing what you're doing and coming up here, especially in this audience. So,
I felt the hostility.
so well done.
That's better.
Well done. Probably a bit of an unfair question, but if you could do it again, would you?
No, because I think I've learned a lot of things in my life now that I didn't really know back then. Firstly, I don't think that in life, you get away with anything. So I had a great time, but I lost out on a lot of things that other people my age back then did. So, when I'm sitting with my friends and they're all chatting about going camping, do you remember that time we went camping when we were 18 and we had a great time? I didn't do that. Some might argue, well, you were staying in some fancy hotel, but it was a solitary thing, so it wasn't the same, So I kind of sometimes get a bit kind of, I'm not a regretful person. I think, I've done my time and everything else, So it's you've just got to get on with life and make the best of what you've got. But to answer your question, I mean, if you'd said to me, do I ever think about it? I think about it all the time because it's something that even now I'm still involved in. I mean, I don't mean genuinely think about doing it. I just mean it's something I think about. But no, I mean, when I came out of prison, it was at least a year before I could walk down the street and ignore a police siren. So these are things that I do not miss, and I also do not miss having to lie to people all the time. I don't miss that, and I quite enjoy having friends who are perfectly aware of my past, and most of them don't care, which is great. So yeah, it's a different point in my life now. But I'm glad I stopped. Yeah.
Any more?
Hello, Sue Power-Price from Milton Reeve.
Hi.
Two-part question, really. The first one was, what was the total value of money that you defrauded from your victims? And secondly, did you ever get round to paying them back?
Okay. Well, I'll answer the second one first, because that's a really short one. No. I didn't. I'll get back to that in a second. But the total value, I am not sure, because as I'm sure you can understand and appreciate, I wasn't keeping a record of how much I'd spent. The police that were involved in the case at the end have estimated that the value was somewhere between £2 and £3 million. I'm going to say that they're probably right because I just don't know. As for paying it back, I think I should point out this money wasn't something that I had physically. Well, I did at times have, maybe £1,000 or a couple of £1,000s. But this wasn't something that I was taking money and then putting it away somewhere and keeping it. for long periods of time. This was money that was being spent on goods and services, mainly services, so first-class flights, hotels, you know. I mean, I think one thing that strikes me is if I really did spend all that money, is how easy it is to spend money when it's there. You know, I can't believe that I spent between £2 and £3 million on hotels and limousines and flights and stuff like that, and champagne. Like, yeah, it's unbelievable. Does that answer your question?
A couple more questions in the middle.
Sorry, I should have said three-part question. The
Okay.
third part being, over what period of time had you spent this £2 to £3 million?
Over 5 years.
5 years?
Yeah. Roughly 5 years,
Yeah.
thereabouts.
Okay, thank you.
Names and numbers? Not your credit card numbers, obviously.
Alanda Reynolds from Zurich. Just a quick question. You struck me as a very confident person. Do you think that was part of your armoury, in that you were able to use that to, you know, convince people to give you the information that you needed? And that's something, if you like, that you use in your tips that you provide to your organisations now, that sort of confidence to sort of work around the systems?
Well, I mean, the thing is, if you want someone to believe something, you have to believe it yourself. So, I mean, what I would say is, yes, I did have a confident persona, because what would happen is, I guess a good analogy would be like when an actor goes into character. I wasn't, at that point, I wasn't a very confident person. I think that's clear from my actions at the time. I thought that money and you know, fancy things were the things that were going to get friends into my life, which was the thing that was missing back then. I soon realised that that's not the case. But the very fact of the reason I did what I did, I think sort of kind of counters that. But to answer your question in the way that I think you want me to, yes, it's very important, because if you want something to be believed by someone else, and you, like, we've all got this, by the way. It's not just like one or two people. We've all got this where we can decipher whether someone is bullshitting. Now, it's not, you know, some people have it in greater measures than others, but we all have it. It's like that gut feeling when someone tells you something, you think, they're lying. And you know what? I bet you'll find that most of the time when you say that to yourself, you're absolutely right. So that woman, for example, at Harvey Nichols, she just knew something was up. And I think the main reason for that was because I was too kind of cocky about the whole thing. And I was like, oh, it's fine, just phone them. You know, rather maybe if I'd put the position of, do you know what, I'm really sorry, I don't have any ID, but I really need the vouchers, it's my wife's birthday or something like that. That might have worked better. Who knows? But yes, confidence is very important, absolutely.
That's one more question, yeah, from the floor.
I'm intrigued as to the cause. So, just as a very quick analogy, just to give you an idea of why I'm asking this.
Sorry, you're intrigued as to
the cause of how you ended up being like this in the first place. Okay? Because we're all angels and we wouldn't dream of doing anything like this, right? So,
did anyone else think that was bullshit?
We're a good one. So just as a quick and terribly serious analogy, a relative of mine, a lady, suffers from terrible anorexia. You know, she's 6 foot tall and she weighs 6 stone. Just terrible, right? This is a mental illness rather than a physical illness first. Okay, that's the reason I mention it. Right. So, question for you: how did you end up, doing whatever you did at school, and then you suddenly end up doing this bad stuff? Was it? I'll give you 5, and you can choose none of them. If you think it's a 6, that's fine. Was it a mental illness? Was it a drug? Was it to do with excitement, which is, if you like, a form of drug? Was it something wrong with your upbringing, or was it something to do with education?
Okay, well, it didn't have anything to do with drugs, and I wasn't...
No, I didn't mean drugs as in heroin. I meant, was it your drug? Because that's the way I meant that word drug.
Oh, okay, I'm glad you clarified. No, basically, I mean, this is something that, see, even when it came to an end, I still didn't really know. And it's only recently, when I think back on things, that I've been able to kind of work out why this might have came to be. Now, I'm not sitting here, I don't want to give the whole, oh, I was a poor kid, I had a really hard time and everything like that. I didn't have a hard time, but what I did have a hard time was, I had a very difficult time interacting socially with other children at school. And this went on throughout my whole school years. My work was always excellent, my teachers always praised my work, but when it came to interacting with other kids in the playground, etc., it was just, there was non-existent social life at school. So for me, what I realised was that people, I remember once I was at school, this was when I was about 7, so I know we're kind of short of time, I'll be as quick as I can, but my auntie gave me £5 for like some reason, I can't remember, some gift, she gave me £5. And I went into school and I thought that one way to get friends would be to get the money and like throw it up in the air and just do it like a scramble. I don't know what you would call it here, but just throw it up and then, you know, and then everyone would like me. Obviously that didn't happen, but they all had loads of sweets that day. So to answer your question, sorry, I do realise we're really short of time here. So I think it was just a fact of it was an escape for me. It was an escape to something better than, or at least what I perceived to be better than what I was actually living at the time.
I think that's been absolutely fascinating for me, and I hope has been for you as well. So I'd like you to thank Elliot and David for a very informative talk.